If you can't pay the fine, you can always sell. We have buyers lined up already. That's what the HOA woman said 5 seconds after stepping out of her luxury SUV. No hello, no shame, just a fake smile and a 3-page violation notice citing everything from improper gravel alignment to non-conforming barn paint. I've lived on this land for decades, built every fence post by hand, and now some clipboard tyrant wants me to sell for pennies I didn't argue. Just nodded, took her papers, and watched her drive off. She thought it was over. She didn't know what she'd just triggered. Where are you watching from? Drop your city below. Bet your HOA hasn't pulled this stunt. I wiped my hands on my work jeans and walked toward the approaching convoy, feeling like I was about to meet my fate. A black Mercedes and 2 sedans pulled in like a corporate hit squad. The gravel crunched under my boots as I approached, and I could feel sweat starting to form on my forehead despite the morning breeze. Was I overreacting to what was probably just a business meeting? Maybe. But every instinct I'd developed in 42 years of life was telling me this wasn't going to be a friendly conversation. The way those vehicles had rolled up my driveway felt calculated, designed to make me feel small and outgunned before a single word was spoken. She stepped out like she ran the world heels, crunching gravel clipboard, ready smile set to hostile, but it was her eyes that really got to me. Cold, calculating, like she was already measuring my property for demolition. Behind her emerged 2 men who were clearly bodyguards, built like refrigerators, wearing expensive suits and sporting those little earpieces you see on Secret Service agents. Keep the strong impression, but use different metaphors. She sat there in her castle-like office light, reflecting off the mahogany desk, making me feel like I'd been summoned to confess my crimes. "Mr. Matthews," the woman said, not bothering with any pleasantries or even a basic good morning. "I'm Victoria Williams, CEO of Williams Development. I need to buy your ranch." The directness hit me like a slap in the face. Not, "Hello, how are you?" or "beautiful property you have here," or even "sorry to bother you this morning." Just straight to business like she was ordering coffee at a drive-thru. I should have appreciated the honesty, I guess, but something about her tone immediately made every muscle in my body tense up. "Well, good morning to you too," I said, trying to inject some civility into what was clearly going to be an uncivilized conversation. "I appreciate your interest, but this place isn't for sale." She barely acknowledged my response before dropping what felt like a financial bomb on my head. $400,000. Cash. That's my offer. I literally had to stop and stare at her for a moment, wondering if I'd heard correctly. Did this woman really just offer me $400,000 for property that any real estate agent would value at over $1 million? I'm no expert in land values, but I know my property is worth at least $1.3 million with all the improvements I've made over the decades. The insulting nature of her offer hit me harder than the offer itself. "Ma'am," I said, trying to keep my voice level, despite feeling like I'd just been punched in the gut. "I appreciate the offer, but this place is worth considerably more than that." Victoria's expression didn't change one bit when I declined her lowball offer. If anything, she looked annoyed that I was wasting her valuable time by not immediately accepting her generous proposal. $400,000 is generous, Mr. Matthews." "Very generous," she said, glancing at her diamond-encrusted watch like she had more important places to be. "I suggest you take it, or things are going to get very difficult for you." The threat in her voice was unmistakable, and I found myself wondering what kind of legitimate businesswoman travels with bodyguards and makes veiled threats to property owners. This felt less like a business negotiation and more like an extortion attempt dressed up in expensive suits. That's when she launched into her grand vision, and honestly, the scope of what she was describing made my head spin. This wasn't some small vacation home development or modest resort project. Victoria was talking about the luxury mountain resort and casino, a $2.8 billion project that would transform our entire rural area into a playground for the ultra-wealthy. Private helicopter landing pads, championship golf courses, high-end shopping, and a full casino that would operate 24 hours a day. My ranch, she informed me like she was doing me the favor of a lifetime, sat on the perfect location for the main casino floor and luxury spa complex. The way she described it, you'd think she was already the owner and I was just some inconvenient tenant who needed to be relocated for the greater good of progress. My family's been working this land for 50 years, I told her, feeling my patience starting to evaporate in the morning heat. This isn't just property to me, it's home, it's legacy. She actually rolled her eyes at that, like my emotional attachment to my family's ranch was some kind of quaint rural nonsense that sophisticated people like her had moved beyond. Sentiment doesn't pay bills, Mr. Matthews, she said with a cold smile. Big mistake. Very big mistake, she added, turning to leave with her entourage of muscle and legal firepower. You'll be hearing from us very soon, and I guarantee you won't like what we have to say. I stood there in my driveway watching that Mercedes and its escort vehicles disappear down the road, and I felt like I'd just been visited by some kind of corporate death squad. The dust settled slowly in the morning air, but the feeling of dread that had settled in my stomach wasn't going anywhere. Something about the way Victoria had delivered that final threat made it crystal clear this wasn't over. It was just beginning. I tried to shake off the encounter, telling myself she was probably just another pushy developer who would eventually move on to easier targets when she realized I wasn't going to be intimidated. Looking back now, I realize how naive that thinking was. Within exactly 2 hours of Victoria's departure, my peaceful morning turned into a bureaucratic nightmare that would have been funny if it wasn't happening to me. Replaced with a general description of escalating violation frequency and absurdity. Instead of specific letter delivery, describe the daily pattern. Each day brought new fines. If yesterday was barn paint non-compliance, today was agricultural aromas incompatible with community sentiment. They hit me with fines for barn color rooster noise, even the spiritual disruption of my gravel. 150 for rustic appearance, inconsistent with established community aesthetics. 250 for operating unlicensed business activities without proper permits. And another 200 for livestock encroachment on community visual standards. $1,100 in fines delivered with the efficiency of a well-oiled harassment machine. I couldn't believe what I was reading as I stood there in the afternoon heat, holding those violation notices like evidence of some elaborate practical joke. In all my years living here, I'd never received a single HOA complaint, let alone a violation notice. Now, suddenly, on the exact same day I refused Victoria's insulting offer, I'm being hit with enough fines to pay for a decent used car. The timing was so obvious it would have been laughable if I wasn't the one being targeted. This wasn't coincidence. This was the opening shot in what I was beginning to realize would be a very ugly war. The second week of Victoria's campaign against me was when I realized this wasn't just harassment. It was a professionally executed siege designed to break my will and bankrupt my spirit. The fines weren't just continuing, they were escalating in both frequency and absurdity with the precision of a military operation. By the end of Friday, I was looking at $3,500 in HOA violations that read like they'd been written by someone with a very creative imagination and a very personal grudge. Atmospheric pollution from uncontrolled agricultural activities. Apparently, that's what they call the natural smell of horses existing. Unauthorized water usage patterns creating community resource strain, because my horses need to drink water from their troughs. Unlawful noise generation during community rest periods, for the crime of my rooster crowing at dawn. The 24/7 surveillance began exactly 1 week after Victoria's visit, and that's when I knew I was dealing with someone who had resources I couldn't begin to match. Private security vehicles started patrolling past my ranch every hour, day and night, like I was some kind of high-security prisoner they were monitoring for escape attempts. These weren't casual drive-bys either. They were slow, deliberate passes where the occupants would stop to take photographs and make notes on clipboards. When I called the HOA office to complain about this obvious intimidation tactic, they fed me some bureaucratic nonsense about enhanced community safety protocols and property monitoring for compliance verification. Enhanced safety protocols. I've been living here peacefully for decades, and suddenly I'm such a threat that they need military-style surveillance. I started timing their patrols out of morbid curiosity, and the precision was almost impressive in its thoroughness. Every hour on the hour, someone was documenting my activities, photographing my property, or recording whatever normal ranch activities they could twist into violations. The psychological impact was exactly what they intended. I found myself becoming paranoid about my own daily routine. Every time I stepped outside to feed the horses or check on the distillery equipment, I wondered what they were photographing and how they planned to use it against me. The constant feeling of being watched was wearing me down in ways I hadn't expected, and I started to understand how other property owners had been broken by this kind of systematic harassment. But the really criminal stuff started when I discovered Victoria had been bribing county officials to manufacture violations against my property, and I mean that literally. The building inspector who showed up that Wednesday morning was nervous, sweating, despite the cool weather, and kept checking his phone like he was expecting instructions from someone. He claimed he'd received multiple anonymous complaints about electrical code violations that would require $1,500 in corrective work, unpermitted structures that needed $2,000 in compliance modifications, and potential groundwater contamination that demanded $3,000 in environmental assessments. I knew every single claim was fabricated because I'd had comprehensive inspections done just 2 years ago, and nothing had changed since then. "How much is Victoria Williams paying you?" I asked him directly, watching his face go pale as paper. The guy stammered something about just doing his job before practically running back to his county vehicle, but his reaction told me everything I needed to know. Later that afternoon, my neighbor mentioned seeing the same inspector having an expensive lunch with Victoria at the fanciest restaurant in 3 counties. Coincidence? Not likely. This woman was systematically corrupting local officials to build a fraudulent case against me, and I was starting to realize I was dealing with someone who operated by absolutely no ethical or legal boundaries. The psychological warfare escalated when Victoria invited me to what she called a private negotiation session at her downtown office complex. I probably should have recognized it as a trap, but I figured I'd hear what she had to say before the situation got any worse. That office looked like a Bond villain's HQ, marble chandeliers, city views. I felt like a farmer visiting the Death Star. Victoria's office was bigger than my entire house, furnished with antiques that probably cost more than my annual income, and designed to make visitors feel small and intimidated. She sat behind a mahogany desk that could have doubled as a helicopter landing pad, flanked by 2 lawyers who specialized in crushing small-town property owners. "Let's be reasonable adults here, Mr. Matthews," she said with a smile that never reached her cold eyes. $520,000. Final offer. Cash closing within 30 days, and I'll even throw in moving expenses. The offer was still insulting, but the real message was in her tone. This wasn't a negotiation, it was an ultimatum. "Refuse this generous proposal," she continued, "and you'll lose everything in legal fees when we take you to court. I've spent more money on legal research than you'll make in the next 5 years, and I guarantee you cannot win a fight against my resources." Sitting in that intimidating office surrounded by corporate predators in $1,000 suits, I'll admit I felt a moment of genuine doubt about my ability to resist their pressure campaign. The financial realities she laid out were genuinely terrifying for someone operating on a rancher's budget. She had Morrison & Associates, the most expensive law firm in the state, on permanent retainer. They charged $800 per hour just to answer their phones, and a full trial could easily cost me $200,000, even if I won. She had unlimited resources, political connections, and a track record of successful property acquisitions that spoke to her effectiveness at this kind of corporate warfare. "I've done this 17 times in 6 different communities," she told me with obvious pride. Property owners always think they can fight back until they see the legal bills start piling up. Then they get realistic very quickly. But you know what? Sitting in that office listening to her catalog all the ways she was going to destroy my life if I didn't surrender something inside me, hardened rather than broke. Maybe it was my father's stubborn streak, or maybe it was just pure spite, but her threats had the opposite effect from what she intended. Still not enough, I told her, watching her confidence falter slightly for the first time since I'd met her. "Then you've just committed financial suicide," she replied, but there was something in her voice that sounded less certain than before. As I walked out of that corporate palace, I realized Victoria Williams might be used to intimidating people, but she wasn't used to people who refused to be intimidated. My neighbor filled me in on Victoria's standard operating procedure when I got home, and the scope of her predatory business model was genuinely shocking. She'd successfully forced out property owners in Pine Valley, Mountain View, and Cedar Ridge using variations of the same systematic harassment campaign she was now running against me. The pattern was always identical: identify valuable property, make an insulting offer, then use legal pressure, HOA violations, corrupted officials, and community manipulation to make the owner's life unbearable until they sold at a fraction of market value. She had perfected this approach over years of practice, and according to public records, she'd never lost a single property acquisition battle. The really infuriating part was discovering that Victoria's harassment campaign was just getting started. By the end of that second week, I was receiving violation notices for things that defied logic and common sense. Excessive natural lighting reflection from my barn's metal roof because apparently sunlight bouncing off buildings was now a community hazard. Unauthorized wildlife attraction because deer sometimes grazed near my property line, as if I had any control over where wild animals chose to eat. Atmospheric disturbance from agricultural machinery for using a perfectly legal tractor to maintain my property. These people were reaching levels of pettiness that should have been illegal, but they were operating within the technical boundaries of HOA authority. That weekend I made a decision that would change everything, though I didn't know it at the time. I was going to dig deeper into the history of this property than anyone had ever bothered to do before. If Victoria Williams wanted to play dirty and use every resource at her disposal to steal my family's land, I was going to find out if there were any secrets buried in the legal history of this area that could level the playing field. I spent Sunday afternoon in my father's old office surrounded by boxes of documents that hadn't been opened in years, feeling like I was searching for a needle in a haystack. But sometimes when you're desperate enough and determined enough, you find things that have been hidden in plain sight for longer than anyone realized. A hunch dragged me to the county records. One dusty folder later, I was staring at a 9-year lease my grandfather had signed under their entire HOA. The clerk looked at me like I'd lost my mind when I requested access to historical land records for the entire area. But I wasn't leaving until I had examined every document that might shed light on the legal history of my property. Most of the morning was spent wading through routine paperwork, property transfers, tax assessments, zoning changes. But I kept digging anyway, driven by a gut feeling that there was something important hidden in those dusty files. The breakthrough came when I found a folder marked Willowbrook Estate, historical documentation, buried in a filing cabinet that looked like it hadn't been opened since the Carter administration. Inside were documents that completely rewrote my understanding of this area's history. In 1975, what we now call our community wasn't a collection of individual properties at all. It was one massive 500-acre ranch owned by a man named Henry Willowbrook, stretching from the mountain foothills all the way down to the valley floor. This wasn't just a large property. It was a genuine Old West cattle operation that had been in the Willowbrook family for 3 generations, complete with grazing rights, water rights, and mineral rights that covered an area larger than some small towns. But the real discovery that made my hands shake as I read it was a manila envelope marked Rental Agreements, 1975. Inside was a legal document that literally changed everything I thought I knew about my situation. It was a 99-year land rental contract between Henry Willowbrook as the property owner and William Matthews, my father, as the renter. But this wasn't just for our current 20-acre ranch. The legal description covered the entire 500-acre Willowbrook estate, and my father was paying exactly $100 per year to rent the whole thing for agricultural and livestock purposes. The contract ran from 1975 to 2074, meaning it still had 49 years remaining. I had to read that document 3 times before the implications really sank in, and even then I wasn't sure I believed what I was seeing. According to this contract, my family had been the legal renters of this entire area for almost 50 years, and the rental agreement had never been terminated or invalidated. Every house in the HOA community, every street, every common area, every blade of grass that Victoria Williams thought she controlled, All of it was built on land that my family was legally renting from the original owner. The scope of this discovery was so massive that I felt dizzy just thinking about it. I once told a story kind of like this on QA Stories. Back then, I thought I was just an outsider looking in. But when I found that 99-year lease myself, I could barely believe my own eyes. The timeline that emerged from the historical records was absolutely mind-blowing and revealed a level of either incompetence or deliberate fraud that stretched back decades. In 1975, my father had signed this comprehensive rental agreement with Henry Willowbrook. In 1978, old Henry died unexpectedly, and his family made the decision to sell the entire estate to Westfield Development Corporation. Between 1982 and 1990, Westfield had systematically subdivided the property and sold individual lots to families who built homes and eventually formed the HOA that now govern the area. But here's the crucial detail that nobody seemed to realize when Henry's family sold the land, and when Westfield sold those individual lots, nobody had bothered to disclose or terminate the existing rental agreement with my family. I called the county clerk over to verify what I was reading, and she confirmed that the rental agreement was properly filed, notarized, and had never been legally terminated according to their records. "This is highly unusual," she said with obvious understatement, "but if this document is authentic and properly recorded, it would take precedence over subsequent property transactions." She explained that rental agreements like this one, especially long-term contracts with proper legal documentation, typically survived changes in ownership unless they were explicitly terminated by mutual agreement or legal action. The more I researched this discovery, the more incredible it became. Victoria Williams and her entire HOA had been operating under the assumption that they owned their properties free and clear, when in reality, they were technically building on and governing land that my family had legal priority over. They'd been making rules, collecting fees, issuing violations, and exercising authority over property that I had a stronger legal claim to than any of them. The development company had either deliberately concealed this information from buyers to avoid complications, or they'd been so negligent in their due diligence that they'd never discovered the existing rental obligations. But I decided to keep this discovery secret for now, which was probably the smartest strategic decision I've ever made in my life. Instead of confronting Victoria immediately with this information, I was going to let her continue digging herself deeper into what was about to become a very expensive legal hole. She was still making public announcements about her casino groundbreaking ceremony, still pressuring me with increasingly ridiculous HOA violations, and still acting like she held all the cards in this property dispute. Meanwhile, I was sitting on information that could potentially give me legal authority over her entire development project. The irony was so perfect, it felt like some kind of cosmic justice. Victoria Williams, who thought she was going to intimidate me into selling my family's ranch for a fraction of its value, was actually living on and developing land that I had legal rights to control. She'd been planning a $2.8 billion casino project on property that I was renting for $100 per year. The woman who had brought bodyguards and lawyers to threaten me was technically trespassing on land that my family had been legally occupying since before she'd ever heard of this area. Over the next few days, I watched Victoria's public confidence with newfound amusement as she announced plans for her casino groundbreaking ceremony and continued her media campaign about removing the stubborn rancher who was blocking community progress. She had no idea that the stubborn rancher she was trying to force out was actually the person with the strongest legal claim to the land she was planning to develop. The casino floor she wanted to build on my property, I was renting the land it would sit on. The luxury spa and resort facilities, also on my rented land. The private helicopter landing pad for high-rolling customers. You guessed it, my land. That weekend I sat on my porch with my horses holding that 99-year rental agreement and feeling like I was holding a winning lottery ticket that nobody else knew existed. Victoria Williams thought she was playing chess while I was playing checkers, but it turned out I'd been holding the ace of spades this whole time without even knowing it. She'd spent weeks systematically destroying my reputation, hitting me with bogus fines, and mobilizing the entire community against me. But soon, very soon, she was going to discover that the land she thought she owned was actually controlled by the very person she'd been trying to destroy. The anticipation was almost unbearable. The official lawsuit papers arrived on a Wednesday morning like a legal death sentence wrapped in expensive letterhead delivered by a process server who looked genuinely apologetic about ruining someone's day. The envelope was thick enough to choke a horse and bore the gold-embossed logo of Morrison & Associates, one of those white shoe law firms that charge $800 per hour just to have their paralegals answer the phone. Inside was a legal document that made my blood pressure spike. Just reading the title, Williams Development Corporation versus Leo Matthews, claiming my ranch created a public nuisance and community hazard, while demanding that the court force me to sell for $350,000 and stick me with all of Victoria's legal costs in the process. Reading through the dense legalese, I calculated that Victoria was planning to hit me with somewhere between $150,000 and $200,000 in attorney fees, court costs, and expert witness expenses. The message was crystal clear: surrender immediately and accept whatever crumbs she was willing to offer, or be financially destroyed by the most expensive legal team money could buy. For someone operating on a rancher's budget, the threat was genuinely terrifying. Even if I somehow managed to win this case, the legal bills alone could force me to sell my ranch just to pay the lawyers. Victoria had calculated this perfectly. She was using the legal system as a weapon to bankrupt me into submission. But Victoria didn't stop with just filing the lawsuit. She turned it into a full-scale media campaign designed to destroy what was left of my reputation in the community. The local newspaper ran a front-page story featuring her carefully crafted quotes about how this landmark case will establish important precedents for community rights and how individual selfishness cannot be allowed to override the greater good. She positioned herself as a reluctant community leader, forced to take legal action against an unreasonable property owner who was single-handedly blocking progress that would benefit everyone in the region. Morrison & Associates filed for an expedited hearing, claiming that my continued presence on the property posed an immediate and ongoing threat to community development and regional economic stability. They submitted professionally prepared evidence packages, aerial photographs of my ranch taken from angles that made it look like a decrepit eyesore, acoustic studies that somehow concluded my horses were a noise pollution hazard, environmental impact reports claiming my agricultural activities were contaminating groundwater, and economic analyses, alleging I was costing the community millions in lost development opportunities. They had expert witnesses lined up to testify about everything from property values to community planning to agricultural environmental impact. Meanwhile, Victoria was orchestrating a sophisticated public pressure campaign that would have made a political operative proud. She organized what she called a community unity dinner, where she celebrated the upcoming legal victory with her investors, supporters, and anyone wealthy enough to buy into her casino project. According to my neighbor, who somehow managed to get invited, she was already dividing up the profits from the development and talking about my ranch like it was ancient history. She had 38 residents sign a petition supporting the lawsuit, and she managed to get local business leaders to issue public statements about how my obstinance was hurting regional economic development. The media coverage was uniformly brutal and obviously coordinated by someone with serious public relations expertise. Headlines like "Stubborn Rancher Blocks," "Billion-Dollar Development," "One Man's Selfishness versus Community Progress and Local Property Owner Holds." Entire region hostage made me feel like the most hated person in 3 counties. The newspaper ran editorial pieces questioning whether individual property rights should be allowed to override community economic development, and the local TV news did segments about how my case could set precedents for property law across the state. Victoria had turned my legal battle into a public spectacle where I was cast as the villain blocking progress for everyone else. Against this overwhelming display of legal and financial firepower, I hired Marcus Thorne as my attorney, which probably looked like bringing a pocket knife to a nuclear war. Marcus walked in beside me calm as ever, just one briefcase against their war chest. His entire office could have fit inside the lobby of Morrison & Associates, and his total annual billing probably equaled what Victoria's lawyers charged for a single week of work. The local coffee shop gossip was that I was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid for taking on one of the state's most powerful law firms, with small-town Marcus as my only legal representation. But Marcus had something Victoria's army of corporate lawyers didn't have. He actually cared about what happened to me and my family's ranch, and he was willing to fight for someone who couldn't afford to buy justice. More importantly, he believed in the legal system's ability to protect individual rights against corporate bullying, even when the odds seemed impossible. Leo, he told me during our first strategy meeting, they're trying to intimidate you into giving up before we even get to court. But sometimes David really does beat Goliath, especially when David is fighting for something that matters more than money. The day before our court appearance, Victoria made one final settlement offer that was clearly designed to humiliate me into complete surrender. $325,000, take it or lose everything in court, and owe her legal team a fortune in the process. She delivered this ultimatum personally, showing up at my ranch with her lead attorney in tow, probably expecting me to cave under the crushing weight of legal and financial pressure. "This is your absolute last chance, Mr. Matthews," she said, but her voice carried a hint of desperation I hadn't heard before. "Tomorrow you'll lose everything and owe us a fortune in legal bills." I looked her right in the eye, thinking about the 99-year rental agreement hidden in my safe, and said, "See you in court, Victoria." The expression on her face told me she wasn't used to people refusing to be terrorized by her corporate warfare tactics. She'd thrown everything she had at me: legal threats, financial intimidation, community pressure, media manipulation, and I was still standing. Tomorrow was going to be the shock of her life, and I could hardly wait to see her face when she realized she'd been playing the wrong game entirely. Sometimes the person who thinks they're holding all the cards discovers that someone else has been holding the deck. Walking into that packed courthouse felt like entering a legal coliseum where I was about to face the lions. Except the lions wore $1,000 suits and carried briefcases full of documents designed to destroy my life. The building itself was intimidating enough. Marble floors, high ceilings, and the kind of formal atmosphere that makes regular people feel small and powerless. Victoria had arrived with her complete legal army, three attorneys from Morrison and Associates, all carrying matching briefcases. They looked like they'd stepped out of a corporate law magazine, and they were clearly expecting this to be a quick and decisive victory. Meanwhile, I walked in with Marcus carrying a single briefcase. We looked completely outmatched by their corporate legal machine. The courtroom was standing room only, packed with residents who had come to watch what most of them assumed would be my public execution. I could feel their eyes on me as I took my seat at the defendant's table, and the weight of their collective judgment was almost overwhelming. These were people who'd bought into Victoria's narrative that I was a selfish obstacle blocking their path to prosperity, and they were here to witness my defeat. Judge Harrison was a stern man in his 60s who'd built his reputation on efficient courtroom management and no-nonsense legal proceedings. As he reviewed the case materials, his expression suggested he was already leaning toward Victoria's side based on the sheer volume of evidence her team had presented. The preliminary motions alone had generated over 300 pages of documentation, all professionally prepared and bound, compared to our relatively modest response filing. The visual contrast was stark and obviously intentional. Victoria's team wanted everyone in that courtroom to see exactly how outgunned I was in this legal battle. Victoria's lead attorney delivered what I have to admit was a legal masterpiece designed to obliterate any sympathy I might have had from the court. His presentation was polished, aggressive, and devastatingly effective, as he painted me as a stubborn relic from a bygone era who was selfishly blocking progress that would benefit thousands of people. According to his carefully constructed argument, my ranch was fundamentally incompatible with modern residential and commercial development. My agricultural operations were systematically degrading regional property values and environmental quality, and my obstinate refusal to accept generous compensation proved I was acting in deliberate bad faith against community interests. The evidence they presented was overwhelming in both scope and professional quality. When Victoria took the witness stand, she gave what I have to admit was an Academy Award-worthy performance that would have been impressive if it wasn't being used to steal my family's land. She presented herself as a successful businesswoman who'd tried every possible diplomatic solution before being reluctantly forced to seek legal remedy against an unreasonable property owner. "Your Honor," she said with carefully practiced sincerity, "we offered Mr. Matthews $400,000 for property that 3 independent appraisers valued at no more than $350,000. We've been more than fair, more than generous, but he simply refuses to listen to reason or consider what's best for the broader community." The way she delivered this testimony, you'd think she was some kind of public servant, trying to help a confused old man understand modern economic realities. Judge Harrison's questions to me revealed exactly how effective Victoria's presentation had been in framing this case. "Mr. Matthews," he said, looking down at me from the bench, "can you explain your refusal to accept what appears to be fair compensation?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut, because it showed how completely Victoria had managed to control the narrative. I felt the weight of the entire courtroom staring at me, waiting for an explanation that would somehow justify my apparent greed and selfishness. "Your Honor, this land represents my family's legacy. No amount of money could replace that." That's when Marcus stood up, and I swear the entire atmosphere in that courtroom shifted like we were about to witness something that would be talked about for years. Instead of defending my right to keep my ranch, which is what everyone expected, and what Victoria's team had prepared to counter, Marcus went in a completely different direction that caught everyone completely off guard. "Your Honor," he said in a calm, clear voice that somehow carried to every corner of the packed courtroom, "we're not here to defend Mr. Matthews' right to stay on his property. We're here to prove that everyone else in this community is illegally occupying his property." The silence that followed was so complete and profound that you could have heard a whisper from the back row. Marcus held up the 1975 rental agreement, like he was presenting evidence in a murder trial, and I felt a surge of satisfaction watching Victoria's world begin to crumble in real time. "Your Honor," he continued with growing confidence, "Mr. Matthews holds a valid 99-year rental contract for the entire 500-acre area where this HOA community was built. This contract predates the community by 10 years and has never been legally terminated or invalidated." The explosion of voices that erupted from the courtroom gallery was unlike anything I'd ever heard. People shouting questions, accusations, and demands for explanation all at once. Victoria completely lost her composure right there in open court, which was both satisfying and terrifying to witness. Victoria leaped up from her seat like she'd been electrocuted, pointing directly at me with a shaking finger, while screaming, "That's impossible! We own this property! We bought it legally! This is fraud! This is a conspiracy!" Judge Harrison had to bang his gavel repeatedly and threaten her with contempt of court to get her to sit down, but you could see she was barely holding herself together. The polished professional businesswoman had been replaced by someone having what could only be described as a complete mental breakdown in front of dozens of witnesses. Her expensive legal team from Morrison and Associates was huddling frantically around their table, clearly scrambling to understand how they'd missed such a crucial piece of evidence in their supposedly thorough due diligence. Judge Harrison called for a 2-hour recess to examine the rental agreement and verify its authenticity, and the chaos that erupted in the courtroom during that break was incredible to witness. Victoria was surrounded by panicked investors and community members demanding explanations she clearly couldn't provide. Her lawyers were making frantic phone calls, probably to researchers and legal experts who could help them understand the implications of a document that apparently invalidated their entire case. Meanwhile, Marcus and I sat calmly at our table, knowing we just dropped a legal nuclear bomb that was going to reshape everything about this dispute. When court resumed, Judge Harrison's expression told me everything I needed to know before he even spoke. After examining the submitted documentation and consulting with the county recorder's office, he announced, "This court finds that the rental agreement in question appears to be authentic, properly filed, and legally binding." You could practically hear Victoria's empire crumbling as he continued. However, given the complexity and far-reaching implications of this evidence, this case requires extensive legal research and documentation review. Trial is postponed for 2 weeks while the court investigates the full scope and validity of this rental agreement. As I walked out of that courthouse, I could hear Victoria behind me frantically trying to convince her lawyers that there had to be some way to challenge the contract, some loophole or technicality that could save her development project. But I knew better. The 2 weeks following that courtroom bombshell were absolutely incredible to watch. And by incredible, I mean Victoria Williams having what appeared to be a complete nervous breakdown in slow motion. The court-ordered investigation into my rental agreement moved quickly, and every single piece of documentation confirmed what Marcus and I already knew: my family's contract was 100% valid, properly filed, and legally enforceable. Victoria, meanwhile, had hired what she called forensic lawyers. Apparently, that's what you call attorneys who charge $300,000 to find non-existent loopholes in ironclad legal documents. Spoiler alert, they found absolutely nothing that could help her. The woman who'd tried to intimidate me into selling my family's ranch for $400,000 was now facing the reality that she'd been operating her entire development project on land she had no legal right to control. The final court hearing was standing room only, with local news cameras and reporters who'd gotten wind of what was being called the property case of the century. Victoria looked haggard, her usual composure cracking under the weight of legal pressure. Her lawyers looked like they were at their own funeral, going up against a 99-year-old rental agreement that they'd somehow missed in their due diligence was going to be a career-defining embarrassment that would follow them for the rest of their professional lives. Judge Harrison's ruling was comprehensive and absolutely devastating for Victoria's side. After thorough legal investigation, he announced to the packed courtroom, "This court finds that Leo Matthews holds a valid, enforceable 99-year rental agreement for the entire 500-acre area in question." You could practically hear Victoria's world collapsing as he continued. All HOA rules, regulations, and fines imposed on Mr. Matthews are therefore legally invalid. Furthermore, Ms. Williams' harassment campaign constituted improper interference with contractual rights. The HOA must negotiate with Mr. Matthews for residents to continue occupying the property. But wait, it gets better. Judge Harrison wasn't finished destroying Victoria's life and career with his comprehensive ruling. Furthermore, he continued, Ms. Williams must pay Mr. Matthews $50,000 in damages for harassment, plus all legal fees incurred in this matter. Her casino development project is permanently enjoined on this property. The courtroom erupted in chaos, but this time the shouting wasn't directed at me. Residents were demanding answers from Victoria about how she'd missed such a crucial legal detail, and you could see her support network crumbling in real time. The same neighbors who'd been her allies just weeks ago were now asking pointed questions about how she'd been so incompetent in her research, and some were already talking about hiring their own lawyers to sue her for misrepresentation. That's when Victoria Williams had what I can only describe as the most spectacular public meltdown I've ever witnessed. She leaped to her feet, screaming at the judge, at me, and at anyone within earshot. "This is completely insane," she shrieked, her voice echoing off the courthouse walls. "I spent 3 years and millions of dollars on this project. He can't just steal everything I've worked for." The transformation was incredible, from polished corporate executive to unhinged person having a complete breakdown in front of dozens of witnesses and news cameras. Court security had to physically escort her from the building as she continued screaming about appeals and lawsuits and how this couldn't be legal in a civilized society. The immediate aftermath was swift and brutal. Within 24 hours, the district attorney announced a criminal investigation into Victoria's business practices, specifically focusing on her pattern of intimidating property owners and her apparent failure to disclose crucial legal information to investors. Her development company's stock price crashed. She lost over $500,000 in planning and legal costs, and multiple investors filed lawsuits claiming they'd been defrauded. The casino project that was supposed to make her rich had instead destroyed her financially and professionally. The local newspaper headline read, "Developer's Empire Crumbles After Legal Shock," and the article detailed how someone who'd seemed untouchable just weeks ago was now facing potential criminal charges. Standing outside that courthouse, surrounded by reporters asking for my reaction to the ruling, I felt like I was living in some kind of alternate reality. That morning, I'd been facing the loss of my family's ranch and financial ruin. Now, I had legal control over a 500-acre area worth millions of dollars, and Victoria Williams was being investigated for fraud. I just wanted to keep my family's ranch, I told the cameras. Victoria Williams tried to steal it from me for a cheap price, but justice has a funny way of working out sometimes. As I drove home past the for sale signs that had popped up overnight in Victoria's former kingdom, I couldn't help but smile. Sometimes the little guy really does win, especially when he's been holding the ace of spades without even knowing it. But here's what really amazed everyone, including myself, despite having the legal right to evict the entire neighborhood and start fresh. I chose a completely different path that nobody saw coming. These were my neighbors, people I'd lived alongside for years, even if some of them had turned against me during Victoria's campaign. Instead of revenge, I decided to create the kind of community I'd always wanted to live in. I established reasonable rental terms of $150 per month per household, eliminated all the ridiculous HOA fines and petty regulations, and implemented common-sense community guidelines that actually made sense for people who just wanted to live their lives in peace. The transformation was remarkable. 8 families who'd been Victoria's strongest supporters decided to move away rather than deal with the new reality. But 15 families stayed and formally apologized for their treatment of me during the conflict. New residents moved in who appreciated the fair and reasonable approach to community management, and property values actually increased by 20% under my leadership. My ranch became a popular destination for horseback riding lessons and whiskey distillery tours, bringing tourism revenue that benefited the entire area. Local restaurants and shops started seeing increased business from visitors who came to experience what people were calling the friendliest neighborhood in the county. 6 months later, I was sitting on my porch reading a newspaper article that would have seemed impossible just a year ago. The headline read, "Former developer sentenced to 5 years in federal prison," and the accompanying photo showed Victoria Williams in an orange jumpsuit being led away in handcuffs. She'd been convicted on multiple counts of fraud, including deliberately concealing the rental agreement from investors and using intimidation tactics to force property sales. Her company had filed for bankruptcy after being hit with over $200 million in investor lawsuits, and her personal assets had been seized to pay restitution. The woman who'd tried to steal my ranch for $400,000 had lost absolutely everything in her pursuit of what she thought would be easy money. The article detailed how her conviction had unraveled a web of fraudulent property deals stretching back over a decade, involving at least 4 different communities where she'd used variations of the same intimidation tactics she'd tried on me. Federal investigators had found evidence that she'd deliberately concealed crucial legal information from investors, systematically bribed local officials to manufacture violations against target properties, and use threats and harassment to force property sales at below-market prices. The woman who'd tried to steal my ranch for $400,000 had been running a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had netted her over $50 million in fraudulent profits before it all came crashing down. My personal life improved beyond anything I could have imagined when I was facing Victoria's harassment campaign. Dr. Sarah Chen, the veterinarian who had been caring for my horses throughout the legal battle, and I started spending more time together, and I found myself happier and more content than I'd been since my father passed away. She'd been one of the few people who'd supported me publicly during Victoria's media campaign, and her loyalty during those dark days meant more to me than any amount of money or property could have. We were married in a ceremony held in the community park we'd built, where Victoria's casino was supposed to go, surrounded by neighbors who'd become genuine friends rather than suspicious adversaries. The economic benefits rippled through the entire area in ways that surprised everyone. Local restaurants saw a 40% increase in business from tourists who came for distillery tours and stayed for weekend getaways. The community became known as the most welcoming neighborhood in the region, and we started hosting an annual Willowbrook Freedom Festival that celebrated standing up to corporate bullying and supporting small-scale sustainable development. Soon, even B&Bs opened to host visitors drawn to the friendliest town in 3 states. Even state economic development officials took notice, inviting me to consult on community development projects that prioritized resident quality of life over maximum profit extraction. The financial transformation was incredible, but almost beside the point. My ranch property value had increased to $3.2 million, and I was earning over $450,000 annually from community rents, distillery operations, tourism activities, and the wedding venue we'd developed using environmentally sustainable practices. Victoria's court-ordered settlement and the additional damages awarded in the federal fraud case had paid off all my debts and left me financially secure for life. But honestly, the money wasn't what mattered most. It was the knowledge that I'd stood up to a bully and created something positive from what had started as an attempt to destroy my life. The national media attention was both unexpected and gratifying. I did interviews with 60 Minutes and CBS Sunday Morning about how one person's legal victory had transformed an entire community's approach to development and governance. The story resonated with people across the country who felt like they were being pushed around by powerful corporate interests, and I started receiving letters from property owners in similar situations asking for advice about fighting back against predatory developers. My story became a case study in business schools and law schools about the importance of thorough due diligence and the dangers of assuming that intimidation tactics would always succeed against determined opposition. The perfect ending to this whole saga came in a letter I received just last week from Victoria's former business partners, writing from their new ethical development consultancy that specialized in community-friendly projects. They asked if I'd be interested in helping them design development approaches that actually benefited existing residents, rather than displacing them for maximum profit. Apparently, my approach to fair community management and sustainable tourism development had become something of a model for how development should actually work when it's done with integrity rather than greed. The irony wasn't lost on me that the same people who had once tried to destroy my life were now asking for my help in learning how to do business ethically. I wrote back thanking them for the offer, but explaining that I was perfectly happy, right where I was, protecting what really mattered to me and proving every day that communities thrive when they're based on mutual respect rather than corporate control. As I sit here on my porch this evening, watching kids play in the community park we built where Victoria's casino was supposed to go, listening to the laughter from the wedding reception happening in our events pavilion, I can't help but reflect on how completely everything changed from that first morning when she rolled up my driveway with her convoy of intimidation vehicles. Victoria Williams called $400,000 generous for my $1 million ranch and tried to steal my home using bodyguards, lawyers, bribed officials, and systematic harassment. She had no idea that I was sitting on a 99-year rental agreement that gave me legal control over her entire $2.8 billion development project. She thought she was playing chess while I was playing checkers, but it turned out I'd been holding the entire deck of cards without even knowing it. Sometimes the person who thinks they have all the power discovers that real power comes from standing up for what's right, no matter how impossible the odds might seem. Sometimes David really does beat Goliath, especially when he's been holding the slingshot all along. Sometimes justice actually works the way it should, even when the game's rigged. Somewhere out there, another Victoria Williams is trying to bully someone, never suspecting they're picking a fight with the wrong person. That thought still makes me smile.
QA Stories signing off for now, but the drama, it never sleeps. Tap that bell if you're ready for round 2.